Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. I was thinking this week about this text, and I was reminded of a story that happened to us when we were in Mount Vernon, Ohio. I was pastoring the Hill Church in Mount Vernon. My daughter Allison had a best friend whose name was Jacinta. And Allison came home from school one day and said, Jacinta's family has invited us over for lunch on Sabbath. And they lived just very close to the Hill Church, and so it would be okay. And so we told Allison, good, tell them we'll be there. And so Sabbath came, and we knew we had plans to go to the Carters for lunch that day. As is usually the case in the life of a pastor, I was one of the last ones to leave the Hill Church that day. My daughter, my son, my wife, we got in the car, drove to the Carters' home, went to the front door, and knocked on the door. Behold, we stand at the door and knock. And the door was opened by my daughter's best friend, Jacinta. And as we looked into the house, it was very obvious that something was wrong. It was obvious that actually we were not expected. And everyone had changed into their gym clothes and was in the kitchen, and mom's making pancakes for lunch. And, Jacinta had told Allison we were invited. She had told us we're invited. There's only one person that hadn't been told we were invited, and that was the mother of the family. They were not ready. Behold, we stand at the door and knock. And even though they answered the door, we did not eat with them that day. They were embarrassed. I thought it was hilarious. So we ultimately ended up at their house. And we had a wonderful meal the next time we met. We went there. She was a very gracious host. She had the table set beautifully. And after lunch, we sat at the table and talked. And have you noticed when you do this, there are a lot more comfortable places to leave the table and go talk, but there's no place like sitting around the table and talking, right? There's something about it. And to me, it's the quintessential, beautiful, perfect Sabbath lunch. Have a nice meal, and then just sit around and talk for an hour or two at the dinner table. Leave the dirty dishes in place. It doesn't matter. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. She redeemed herself very, very well. Today, you have a meal prepared for you. It is not a formal Sabbath meal, but you can see it right here. And Jesus says to you today, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and will open the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. Today, we have a feast of grape juice and bread, but it will be the greatest feast of all. I've been thinking a lot about this verse this week, Revelation 3:20, and I want you to see 3 short points from this verse as we ready ourselves for the Lord's Supper. The first I want you to see is the beginning phrase, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Now the word knock in the original language of Greek is written in a specific way that gives the idea of continuous action. Greek, in English we have tenses, past, present, future, basically. But Greek has more tenses, and there's more information included in those tenses. And this word knocking is written in a way that gives you the idea that Jesus is knocking and continuing to knock. It's continuing action. It's not like Jesus knocked at your heart's door once upon a time and you didn't answer it and you're done. It's a continuous action. He's knocking at your heart's door continually, wanting to gain entry into your life. He takes the initiative. He comes to the door of your life and knocks continually. This is one of the things that makes Christianity distinctive of other world religions. In many other world religions, the worshipers seek God. In Christianity, God seeks you. Now, if that doesn't amaze you, you become jaded with Christianity. If that doesn't amaze you, that the God of the universe, who holds the stars in their place, the God of the universe who has billions and billions and trillions and times trillions of inhabitants in it, calling upon His name, He hears your voice. He cares individually about you. He pursues you. Luke chapter 19, verse 10, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Amazing. He pursues you. There's this old poem by a guy named Francis Thompson, who, the poem is entitled, "The Hound of Heaven." It's about God's pursuit of him, even though he ran away from God. And in the poem, it's quite frankly a difficult poem to read. It's about 100 years old. It's somewhat difficult to read. But you read there, Thompson writes about how he ran away from God and how God pursued him. Maury Venden tells a story in his writings about God's part in salvation and man's part in salvation. Maury Venden says that man's part in salvation is to run. God's part's to chase him down, to catch him. I love that. God is the pursuer. John Bunyan, in his book Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, writes that he sees God pursuing him and he's running away from God. And every time he looks over his shoulder, he sees God pursuing him with a pardon in his hand. Amazing. God wants to pursue you. He wants to give you a pardon. There's a monk from the 12th century AD. His name was Bernard. He writes this. He says, "However early thy might awake and rise for prayer in their..." However early they might wake and rise for prayer in their chapel on a cold midwinter morning, or even in the dead of night, they would always feel that God was there awake before them, waiting for them. Nay, it was He who had awakened them to seek His face. I love this picture of God pursuing you. "Behold, I am standing at the door, and I'm knocking continuously." He takes the initiative. What's the goal? The second point. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. What's the purpose of him knocking to gain entry? So that he can be with you. Table fellowship. You know, there's something, we already talked about that. There's something about table fellowship. You know, when I was a child, we had certain names for the meals of the day. We called it breakfast, dinner, and supper. That was the country way. I know some people today think dinner is the evening meal. They say breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but it's still supper. And this is the meal that's being talked about. When you read the Greek, it's this meal, it's the evening meal, it's the meal in which the family lingers that Jesus is talking about here, about eating with you. It's the big meal when the day is over, when the family sits and lingers around the table. This is the kind of relationship that Jesus wants with you, the kind of fellowship and friendship, the kind of relationship he wants with you, where we can sit and talk around the table. And as I said before, I think the Sabbath lunch atmosphere is the perfect picture of that in my mind. You know, when you just sit at the table and talk, and there's a conversation going on at this end and a conversation going on at that end, and someone from this end dips into the conversation on that end. You know what I'm talking about. Then the whole table gets talking, and then it's just, that's what he wants from you. The third point, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone will open the door, I will come in with him and eat with him and he with me. Notice that there is something necessary on man's part. The only thing that's necessary on man's part is to open the door. To respond. Jesus seeks us. He keeps knocking. We open the door. We say yes. Can you go to the next slide for me? There we go. Back one. I'm sorry, go ahead. That one. There are many pictures of Jesus in Revelation 3:20. It's a more modern one. He's standing at the door and knocking. But you know, of all the pictures of Revelation 3:20, there's one particular thing they all have in common. And what they all have in common is that there is no doorknob on the door. The doorknob is missing. I remember many years ago, my wife and I went to a very quaint bed and breakfast. It was a very old bed and breakfast, well over 100 years old in this old home, and it was so much fun to be there. And we got this room. It had this 4-poster bed, and it was just lovely. And the doors were beautifully carved wooden doors, and the doorknobs were crystal doorknobs, clear crystal doorknobs, like the old style. They were the old style. And I remember going into this room and shutting the door behind us, and maybe I shut the door a little too hard. I don't know what happened. I didn't slam the door. I was happy to be there, And I remember hearing something hit the floor on the other side of the door. Well, that was strange. But I didn't really think about it. We put our luggage in, and we were going to go out and explore the area for a little while. And as we went to open the door to go out of the room, the doorknob came off in my hand. And it turns out what had happened was when I shut the door, the other side doorknob with the cylinder that goes through to actuate the plunger had fallen off into the floor, and so all I had on my side was an empty doorknob, and so I look at the door, and the doorknob is missing, the doorknob on both sides, and we are inside the room. You see what's going on here. It's like the doorknob is missing. So here's the question: how do you get through the door if the doorknob is missing? All we could do was bang on the door and yell and hope somebody came by and saw our predicament and could put the door knob back on so we could match it up and get out of the room. If there is no doorknob, it's impossible to get through the door. Here's the dilemma. Jesus is taking the initiative. He wants to spend time with you. He's knocking at the door. The promise is, if you will open the door, He will come in. But there's the if. If you will open the door. On all these paintings of Revelation 3:20, there is no doorknob on the outside. The door can only be opened from the inside. Our response is necessary. As I considered this text, it's not really a communion text, but maybe it is. Because communion, the Lord's Supper, offers us the chance again to open the door to Jesus into our lives, to allow Him to come in. Now, there have been some people who have misunderstood, perhaps, Revelation 3:20, and talks about, in an evangelistic setting, people who have not given their hearts to Jesus, talks about how God is knocking at your heart's door. Won't you let Him in? And I believe that's certainly a legitimate passage idea. But, you know, Revelation 3:20 is in a very specific setting. Revelation 3:20 is the end of the message to the church of Laodicea. The church who is rich, thinks they're rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing, but are really poor and blind and miserable and naked. This text is not primarily pertaining to non-Christians and unbelievers. This text is for church members. This text is for church members who need to recommit themselves to Jesus again. Today, it's your chance, your opportunity, as we partake of these emblems of the Lord's body and of His blood. You can say yes to Jesus all over again. We're going to separate for our foot washing at this point in time. Everything is set up in the gym. If you perchance are visiting, just go down the hallway, out the sanctuary doors, straight down the hallway, down the steps, or you can, if you have any problem with the steps, you can use the elevator. We'll have our foot washing downstairs, and then we'll come back together here. We will have Graceville here in the sanctuary for the children while we are having the foot washing service down there. We'll separate now and then come back together for the Lord's Supper.